Connor Blake thought he was pulling the ultimate prank when he and his crew spent their lunch break drilling bolts through the ceiling tiles, rigging a metal chair to dangle 3 feet above the classroom floor. What he didn't know was that the quiet new kid he was targeting had spent 18 months jumping out of perfectly good airplanes at 30,000 feet, dodging enemy fire in places most people couldn't pronounce. Sometimes the biggest mistakes come wrapped in the smallest packages, and Jake Thompson was about to remind everyone at Roosevelt High School that still waters run deeper than anyone imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Jake Thompson shuffled through the main entrance of Roosevelt High School with all the enthusiasm of someone walking to their own execution. At 17, he carried himself with the careful posture of someone trying very hard to appear unremarkable. His brown hair was kept just long enough to cover the military precise cut underneath, and his clothes hung loose on a frame that was deceptively compact. Most people who glanced his way saw exactly what he wanted them to see: another awkward teenager trying to navigate the social minefield of high school. The irony wasn't lost on him that after surviving actual minefields in Afghanistan, he was nervous about walking into advanced physics class. Pine Ridge, North Carolina was supposed to be his fresh start, a chance to blend into the background and finish his education like any normal kid. His mother had found work at the local hospital, and they'd rented a small apartment on the civilian side of town, far enough from the military base to avoid uncomfortable questions about his past. 3 months into his junior year, Jake had perfected the art of invisibility. He'd learned to slouch just enough to hide the ramrod-straight posture that 18 months of military training had burned into his muscle memory. He kept his head down during conversations, avoiding the direct eye contact that had become second nature during briefings and tactical discussions. Most importantly, he'd mastered the fine art of looking soft, unthreatened, and completely harmless. The truth was considerably more complex. Jake Thompson had joined the Army at 15 using documentation that claimed he was 18, driven by a combination of grief over his father's death in Iraq and a burning desire to follow in his footsteps. For a year and a half, he'd served as a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne Division, completing 2 tours overseas before a routine records check revealed his actual age and resulted in an honorable discharge that technically never should have happened. The Army brass, embarrassed by their oversight and impressed by his service record, had quietly arranged for his records to be sealed and his educational benefits to remain intact. Now he sat in the back row of Mr. Patterson's advanced physics class, listening to discussions about trajectory and gravitational force while carefully not mentioning that he'd calculated similar equations while coordinating supply drops in hostile territory. When classmates struggled with concepts about air resistance and terminal velocity, Jake bit his tongue rather than share that he'd experienced these principles firsthand during over 40 combat jumps. His notebook contained careful equations and detailed diagrams, but none of his classmates knew that his understanding came from practical application rather than textbook theory. The other students saw him as quiet, maybe a little shy, possibly not the brightest bulb in the classroom. Jake encouraged this perception, asking basic questions he already knew the answers to, and occasionally pretending to struggle with concepts that were elementary compared to the technical training he'd received. His teachers appreciated his politeness and steady work ethic, but none suspected that his careful attention to detail came from years of understanding that small mistakes could have life and death consequences. His mother worried constantly about his transition back to civilian life. She'd noticed how he still woke up before dawn, how he unconsciously scanned every room for exits, how he flinched slightly at unexpected loud noises. They'd agreed together that his military service would remain their secret, partly to protect him from difficult questions about how a minor had ended up in combat, but mostly because they both hoped that pretending to be normal might eventually make it true. Jake wanted desperately to believe that he could go back to being just another teenager, that the experiences that had aged him far beyond his years could somehow be set aside. The challenge was that everything about high school felt surreal. After his experiences overseas, students complained about homework deadlines while he remembered coordinating medical evacuations under fire. Teachers stressed about standardized test scores, while he'd once spent 3 days helping to secure a forward operating base against insurgent attacks. The social dynamics that seemed so important to his classmates felt trivial compared to the life and death decisions he'd faced on a regular basis. Despite his efforts to blend in, Jake found himself naturally gravitating toward other students who seemed to exist on the periphery of the social hierarchy. He'd struck up a friendship with Marcus Rivera, a quiet junior who spent most of his time in the art studio working on elaborate sculptures that somehow never made it into the school's display cases. Marcus asked few personal questions and seemed content to sit together during lunch, discussing books and movies rather than the mica. Latest gossip about who was dating whom or which party everyone was planning to attend over the weekend. Jake's biggest fear wasn't that someone would discover his military background, but that the person he'd become during his service would somehow surface in an environment where it didn't belong. He'd seen what violence could accomplish, understood how quickly situations could escalate, and carried skills that had no place in a suburban high school setting. His mother's constant reminders to stay out of trouble weren't necessary. Jake had no intention of letting anyone discover what he was capable of when pushed too far. What he hadn't counted on was Connor Blake's determination to find out exactly how far the quiet new kid could be pushed before he broke. Connor Blake ruled Roosevelt High School the way a medieval lord might have controlled his fiefdom, through a combination of inherited privilege, physical intimidation, and an intuitive understanding of social hierarchies. As the son of Blake, Automotive's owner, the largest car dealership chain in Pine Ridge, Connor had grown up with the assumption that everything in his small North Carolina town eventually bent to his family's influence. His father's donations had funded the new football stadium, his mother chaired the school board's fundraising committee, and Connor himself wore his status like a custom-tailored Letterman jacket. At 18, Connor stood 6 feet 3 inches, tall with the kind of broad shoulders and confident swagger that came from years of being told he was destined for greatness. He'd been varsity quarterback since sophomore year, maintained a respectable B+ average without breaking a sweat, and had already received verbal commitments from 3 college football programs. More importantly, he possessed that particular combination of charisma and cruelty that made him simultaneously popular and feared throughout the hallways of Roosevelt High. His inner circle consisted of Austin Reed and Tyler Cross, both fellow football players who served as his enforcers and audience. Austin was built like a defensive lineman, all muscle and aggression, with the kind of mean streak that made him useful for handling situations requiring physical persuasion. Tyler was smaller but smarter, the type who could engineer elaborate schemes while maintaining plausible deniability. Together, they formed a triumvirate that had maintained unchallenged control over the school's social ecosystem for 3 years running. Connor's domain extended far beyond the athletic department. He determined who got invited to the parties that mattered, which students were worthy of respect, and most importantly, who deserved to be reminded of their place in the carefully maintained hierarchy. Teachers generally looked the other way when Connor exercised his authority, partly because his family's influence made complaints difficult, but mostly because his methods were usually subtle enough to avoid official notice. He understood that true power operated in the spaces between rules, in the gray areas where intention was difficult to prove and consequences could be avoided. The arrival of Jake Thompson had initially seemed like a non-event to Connor. New students appeared regularly in Pine Ridge, usually military kids whose parents had been transferred to the nearby base, and most either quickly found their place in the established order or transferred, elsewhere after realizing they didn't fit. Jake seemed to fall into the first category, quietly accepting his position at the bottom of the social ladder without causing any disruption or demanding attention. For the first 2 months of the school year, Jake had been essentially invisible to Connor and his crew. He sat in the back of classrooms, ate lunch alone or with Marcus Rivera, and never participated in any activities that might draw notice. He seemed perfectly content to exist on the periphery, which Connor interpreted as an appropriate acknowledgement of the natural order. Some students needed to be taught their place through direct intervention, but Jake appeared to understand his role instinctively. What bothered Connor, though he couldn't articulate exactly why, was Jake's complete lack of reaction to the usual social pressures that kept other students in line. When Connor's group dominated conversations and shared classes, Jake didn't seem intimidated or resentful. He simply appeared uninterested. When they commandeered tables in the cafeteria or monopolized equipment in gym class, Jake adapted without complaint or obvious frustration. Most students showed some response to being marginalized, either anger they tried to hide or excessive eagerness to prove themselves worthy of acceptance. Jake showed nothing. The first direct interaction between Connor and Jake had occurred during a particularly brutal October practice session, when Coach Morrison had ordered the team to run conditioning drills in the parking lot adjacent to the academic buildings. Connor had noticed Jake walking past on his way to the library, moving with a kind of efficient, purposeful gait that somehow annoyed him. Without really thinking about it, Connor had deliberately kicked a football in Jake's direction, not hard enough to hurt, but with enough force to make a point. Jake had caught the ball reflexively, his hands moving with surprising speed and precision. For just a moment, his posture had changed, becoming more alert and focused, before he'd tossed the ball back with a casual underhand throw and continued walking. The entire interaction had lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but something about Jake's movement had struck Connor as wrong, somehow inconsistent with the harmless persona he'd been projecting. Austin had laughed about the incident afterward, joking about how the new kid had looked scared when the ball came flying at him. But Connor hadn't seen fear in Jake's reaction. He'd seen something that looked almost like trained reflexes being consciously suppressed. The observation lingered in his mind like a splinter, creating an irritation he couldn't quite identify or resolve. Over the following weeks, Connor found himself paying more attention to Jake's behavior, looking for signs that might explain his unusual composure. He noticed that Jake never seemed surprised by sudden noises, that his eyes constantly tracked movement in his peripheral vision, and that he positioned himself in rooms with clear sight lines to exits. These weren't necessarily unusual habits, but they formed a pattern that suggested someone accustomed to being aware of their surroundings in ways that went beyond normal teenage self-consciousness. The mystery deepened during a particularly intense discussion in Mr. Patterson's advanced physics class about ballistic trajectories and projectile motion. Connor, who took the class primarily because it looked impressive on college applications, had been struggling with a problem involving calculating the optimal angle for maximum range when atmospheric resistance was factored into the equation. He'd noticed Jake working through the same problem with apparent ease, his calculations precise and his diagrams detailed in ways that suggested genuine understanding rather than mechanical memorization. When Mr. Patterson had asked for volunteers to present their solutions, Connor had deliberately called attention to Jake's work, partly to see how he'd respond to being put on the spot. Jake had reluctantly approached the whiteboard and walked through his calculations with quiet competence, explaining complex concepts in terms that made them accessible to students who'd been struggling with the material. His presentation had been clear and methodical, but what struck Connor was the casual way Jake had referenced real-world applications, mentioning factors like wind speed and elevation changes, as if they were considerations he dealt with practically rather than theoretically. After class, Connor had approached Jake with what appeared to be friendly curiosity, asking where he'd learned to handle physics problems so effectively. Jake's response had been carefully vague, mentioning online tutorials and extra study time. But his body language had suggested discomfort with the attention. More tellingly, when Connor had jokingly asked if Jake had ever considered military service, given his apparent aptitude for ballistics calculations, Jake's reaction had been subtle but unmistakable, a momentary tensing of his shoulders and a slight shift in his breathing that suggested the question had hit closer to home than intended. That night, Connor had found himself genuinely curious about Jake Thompson for the first time since his arrival. Most students at Roosevelt High were easy to categorize and understand, their motivations and backgrounds readily apparent through observation and casual conversation. Jake remained frustratingly opaque, presenting a surface that seemed designed to discourage deeper investigation while simultaneously containing hints that there was much more beneath the carefully maintained exterior. The realization that Jake was actively concealing something significant triggered Connor's competitive instincts in ways he hadn't expected. Throughout his life, Connor had been accustomed to understanding and controlling his environment, to being able to read people and predict their responses. Jake's opacity represented a challenge to that control, a puzzle that demanded solving, not because it served any particular purpose, but because leaving it unsolved felt like accepting defeat. Austin and Tyler had initially been skeptical of Connor's growing fixation on what seemed like an insignificant target. Jake posed no threat to their social dominance, commanded no resources worth acquiring, and maintained no relationships that could enhance or threaten their position. From their perspective, expending energy on someone so clearly outside their sphere of influence seemed pointless and potentially counterproductive. But Connor had developed an intuitive sense that Jake's carefully projected harmlessness was exactly that, a projection. The more he observed, the more convinced he became that Roosevelt High's newest student was not what he appeared to be, and that discovery represented both an opportunity and a necessity. If Jake was hiding something significant, Connor needed to know what it was. If he was genuinely as unremarkable as he seemed, then he needed to be reminded that anonymity was a privilege that could be revoked at any time. The decision to target Jake directly hadn't been made impulsively. Connor spent several days considering the most effective approach, weighing options that would provide maximum impact while maintaining his reputation for creative rather than merely brutal intimidation. The goal wasn't simply to humiliate Jake, but to strip away whatever protective facade he'd constructed and reveal whatever truth lay underneath. The chair suspended from the ceiling would serve as both punishment and test, a way of forcing Jake into a situation where his true character would necessarily emerge. Jake's secret weighed on him like a loaded rucksack that he could never set down, a constant reminder of the distance between who he appeared to be and who he actually was. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Every morning as he deliberately messed up his hair to hide the precision of his military cut, every time he forced himself to slouch instead of maintaining the perfect posture that had been drilled into him through countless inspections, he felt the disconnect between his carefully constructed civilian persona and the soldier he'd been trained to become. The truth was that Jake Thompson had experienced more combat at 16 than most career military personnel saw in 20 years of service. His initial deployment to Afghanistan had been supposed to be a routine assignment to a relatively quiet, forward operating base, but the Taliban had different plans. Within his first month overseas, Jake had participated in 17 combat operations, including 3 major engagements that had earned his unit a commendation for valor under fire. By his second deployment, he was being selected for specialized missions that required his particular combination of youth, small stature, and proven reliability under pressure. Paratrooper training had come naturally to Jake in ways that surprised even his instructors. While other recruits struggled with the mental challenges of jumping from aircraft at altitude, Jake had discovered an almost meditative calm in the moments between leaving the plane and feeling his chute deploy. The mathematics of wind drift. Calculations, the precision required for landing zone accuracy. The split-second decision-making necessary when equipment malfunctioned or landing conditions changed. All of it had clicked for him with an ease that suggested natural aptitude. Enhanced by intensive training. His service record contained details that would have been impressive for a career soldier, let alone someone who wasn't legally old enough to vote. Jake had completed advanced tactical training courses typically reserved for special operations. Candidates. He'd earned certifications in demolitions, communications, and field medicine that qualified him to operate independently in hostile territory. Most significantly, he'd developed the kind of situational awareness and threat assessment, capabilities that became second nature after months of operating in environments where a moment's inattention could prove fatal. The skills he'd acquired went far beyond basic military training. Jake could read terrain like other teenagers read social media, automatically identifying cover positions, escape routes, and potential ambush sites wherever he went. He'd learned to move silently across various surfaces, to remain motionless for hours when necessary, and to make accurate threat assessments based on minimal visual information. His hands had been trained to field strip and reassemble weapons in complete darkness, to treat serious injuries with limited medical supplies, and to tie knots that could secure loads weighing several hundred pounds. But perhaps most importantly, Jake had developed the psychological conditioning that allowed soldiers to function effectively in life-threatening situations. He'd learned to suppress fear responses that might interfere with mission effectiveness, to make tactical decisions while under extreme stress, and to maintain operational focus even when witnessing events that would traumatize most civilians. The training had rewired his nervous system in ways that couldn't be easily undone, creating reflexes and response patterns that remained active even in the safety of suburban North Carolina. The decision to conceal his military background hadn't been made lightly. Jake's mother had spent months researching the psychological challenges faced by young veterans transitioning back to civilian life, and everything she'd learned had convinced her that anonymity offered the best chance for her son to develop normally. Studies showed that teenage veterans often struggled with feeling disconnected from their peer groups, that their experiences created barriers to forming typical adolescent relationships, and that the identity confusion between soldier and civilian could lead to serious adjustment problems. More practically, Jake's unusual military service raised questions that were difficult to answer without revealing the documentation irregularities that had allowed his underage enlistment. Military records were sealed, but word traveled quickly. In communities with large veteran populations, and Pine Ridge's proximity to the base meant that many residents had connections to active duty or retired personnel. If Jake's background became known, it would inevitably lead to investigations that could prove embarrassing for everyone involved, including the Army officials who had quietly arranged his honorable discharge. Jake's mother had been very specific about her expectations for his civilian life. She wanted him to experience the normal teenage milestones he'd missed during his military service, attending school dances, playing sports, dating, worrying about college applications, and all the other experiences that comprise typical adolescent development. She'd made him promise to avoid situations that might trigger his military training, to resist the urge to take charge during crises, and most importantly, to never reveal the extent of his capabilities unless faced with genuine life-threatening danger. The promise had seemed reasonable when they'd made it, but Jake was discovering that suppressing his true nature required constant effort and created unexpected psychological strain. Simple activities like walking through crowded hallways triggered automatic threat assessments that he had to consciously override. Group projects in school activated leadership instincts that he had to carefully suppress. Even casual conversations with classmates required him to monitor his responses to avoid revealing knowledge or experiences that would seem unusual for someone his apparent age and background. The most challenging aspect of maintaining his civilian facade was dealing with the boredom and frustration that came from pretending to struggle with concepts he'd mastered years earlier. Advanced physics problems involving projectile motion and ballistic trajectories were elementary compared to the calculations he'd performed while coordinating supply drops in contested airspace. History discussions about recent military conflicts felt surreal when he'd personally participated in some of the events being described in abstract terms. Literature classes analyzing themes of courage and sacrifice in wartime seemed almost insulting when he'd witnessed both qualities displayed by friends who hadn't survived to read about them in books. Jake had developed elaborate mental strategies for managing the cognitive dissonance between his actual capabilities and his projected limitations. He practiced appearing confused by material he understood instinctively, asking questions designed to seem earnest rather than sophisticated, and timing his academic performance to suggest steady improvement rather than existing mastery. The deception required him to be constantly aware of how much competence he could safely display without arousing suspicion. The loneliness was perhaps the most difficult aspect of his transition. Jake's shared experiences with his military unit had created bonds of trust and mutual dependence that were impossible to replicate in civilian relationships. His former teammates had understood him completely because they'd faced the same challenges, overcome the same fears, and developed the same skills through shared hardship. His current classmates lived in a different world entirely, one where the most serious problems involved academic deadlines, social relationships, and college applications. Marcus Rivera had become Jake's closest friend at Roosevelt High precisely because he seemed content with surface-level interactions and didn't probe for personal details that might prove uncomfortable. Their conversations focused on shared interests like books and movies, topics that didn't require Jake to invent false histories or pretend ignorance about subjects he knew well. Marcus seemed to understand instinctively that Jake preferred privacy, and he respected that boundary without making it seem unusual or suspicious. Still, Jake found himself carefully monitoring every interaction for signs that his carefully constructed persona might be slipping. He'd catch himself standing too straight during conversations, moving too quickly when responding to sudden noises, or demonstrating knowledge that seemed inconsistent with his supposed background. Each small slip required immediate correction and mental note-taking to avoid similar mistakes in the future. The physical aspects of concealing his training were equally challenging. Jake's body had been conditioned for peak performance through months of intensive training, and maintaining that conditioning without revealing its extent required creative solutions. He'd found a 24-hour gym across town where he could work out during late-night hours when he was unlikely to encounter classmates. His exercise routines had to be carefully planned to maintain his fitness level without developing the kind of obvious musculature that might prompt questions about his training background. Sleep remained problematic despite his mother's hopes that time would resolve his adjustment issues. Jake still woke before dawn most mornings, his body maintaining the schedule that had been necessary during deployment. His dreams frequently featured scenarios that required tactical responses, and he sometimes found himself conducting unconscious security checks of his bedroom and the apartment perimeter before fully awakening. These habits were becoming less frequent, but they served as constant reminders that his military conditioning ran deeper than conscious thought. The irony wasn't lost on Jake that he'd survived multiple combat deployments, only to find high school social dynamics genuinely stressful. The rules governing teenage behavior seemed arbitrary and constantly shifting. Unlike military protocols that provided clear guidance for virtually every situation, academic success required different skills than operational effectiveness, and social acceptance demanded qualities that had no correlation with combat readiness. Yet Jake had committed to making this transition work, both for his mother's peace of mind and for his own future. He understood that his military service, while valuable, represented only one potential path for his life. College and career opportunities required different preparations, and the civilian skills he was developing would prove essential regardless of his eventual chosen profession. The question was whether he could maintain his deception long enough to complete his education without someone discovering the truth about his background. What Jake couldn't have anticipated was that Connor Blake's growing curiosity would soon force him to choose between maintaining his carefully constructed anonymity and protecting himself from escalating harassment. The balance he'd worked so hard to maintain was about to be tested in ways that would make pretending to be normal impossible. Connor Blake's methodology for maintaining social control at Roosevelt High had been refined through years of careful observation and strategic application. Unlike crude bullies who relied solely on physical intimidation, Connor understood that true power came from creating systems where his targets participated in their own humiliation. He'd learned that public embarrassment was far more effective than private confrontation, that psychological pressure produced longer-lasting results than physical aggression, and that maintaining plausible deniability was essential for avoiding administrative intervention. His techniques had been developed through extensive experimentation during his freshman and sophomore years, when he'd tested various approaches on different types of targets to determine which methods produced optimal results. Shy students responded best to social isolation and public exposure of their insecurities. Academic overachievers could be effectively neutralized by questioning their competence in front of teachers and peers. Athletes from competing sports required more subtle approaches that undermined their confidence without providing obvious evidence of interference. Connor's greatest skill lay in his ability to identify each student's particular vulnerabilities and exploit them with surgical precision. He possessed an intuitive understanding of human psychology that allowed him to predict how individuals would respond to specific types of pressure, and he developed an extensive repertoire of tactics that could be deployed individually or in combination depending on the situation. More importantly, he'd learned to delegate the actual implementation of his strategies to Austin and Tyler, maintaining his own reputation for leadership while ensuring that any negative consequences fell on his subordinates. The power structure he'd established extended throughout Roosevelt High's student body like an invisible web of influence and intimidation. Students understood without being explicitly told that Connor's approval could elevate their social status, while his disapproval could result in months of systematic harassment. Teachers generally appreciated Connor's ability to maintain order among his peers, interpreting his control as natural leadership rather than recognizing the coercive methods he employed to achieve compliance. Connor's influence reached beyond the school itself into the broader Pine Ridge community. His family's prominence meant that his version of events carried significant weight with parents, school board members, and local business owners who preferred to avoid conflicts with the Blake family's extensive network of relationships. When disputes arose involving Connor and other students, the resolution almost invariably favored his account of events, regardless of witness testimony or physical evidence that might suggest alternative interpretations. The carefully maintained ecosystem of fear and respect that Connor had constructed required constant attention and occasional demonstrations of power to remain effective. Students who challenged his authority, either directly or through passive resistance, needed to be reminded of their place in the hierarchy through increasingly creative and public humiliation. Connor had developed a particular talent for engineering situations where his targets appeared to bring punishment upon themselves, creating the impression that their suffering resulted from poor judgment rather than systematic persecution. Jake Thompson's arrival had initially seemed to present no particular challenge to Connor's established order. New students typically required a brief period of orientation to understand their position in the social hierarchy, but most adapted quickly. Once they experienced the consequences of overstepping invisible boundaries, Jake had appeared to accept his marginal status without resistance, avoiding the kind of attention-seeking behavior that usually triggered Connor's intervention protocols. What distinguished Jake from previous targets, however, was his apparent immunity to the standard pressure tactics that Connor employed to maintain control over potentially problematic students. Social isolation didn't seem to affect Jake's emotional state or academic performance. Deliberate exclusion from group activities produced no visible frustration or attempts to gain acceptance. Most puzzling, Jake showed no interest in improving his social standing through the usual methods of demonstrating deference to Connor and his inner circle. The first deliberate test of Jake's responses had occurred during a seemingly casual encounter in the hallway, between third and fourth periods. Connor had deliberately positioned himself to block Jake's path to his next class, creating a situation where Jake would need to either assert himself or demonstrate submission by asking permission to pass. Most students in similar situations would either apologize for the inconvenience or make some gesture acknowledging Connor's superior status. Jake had simply stood quietly, making no attempt to push past but showing no signs of intimidation or deference. After several seconds of uncomfortable silence, Connor had stepped aside with a dismissive comment about people needing to watch where they were going. Jake's response had been a polite thank you that contained no acknowledgement of the power dynamic Connor had attempted to establish. The interaction had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it had left Connor with the unsettling feeling that Jake hadn't recognized the test for what it was, or worse, had recognized it and chosen not to participate. Subsequent attempts to provoke responses from Jake had proven equally unsuccessful. Connor's group had begun occupying tables adjacent to wherever Jake sat during lunch, conducting loud conversations designed to make him feel unwelcome and excluded. Jake had continued eating his meals with apparent contentment, showing no signs that he noticed or cared about their proximity. When they deliberately knocked into his chair while passing his table, Jake had steadied himself without complaint or visible annoyance. The failure of these standard intimidation techniques had prompted Connor to escalate his approach. He'd begun asking Jake direct questions during shared classes, framing them as friendly interest while actually probing for weaknesses or inconsistencies in Jake's carefully maintained persona. These conversations had revealed Jake's impressive academic capabilities, particularly in subjects requiring analytical thinking and practical problem-solving. But they'd also highlighted his reluctance to discuss personal background or experiences outside school. Connor's growing fascination with Jake had not escaped the notice of Austin and Tyler, who initially viewed their leader's interest as a pointless distraction from more productive targets. Roosevelt High contained numerous students who could be more easily manipulated for social or practical advantage, and Jake's obvious desire to remain invisible seemed to make him an unlikely candidate for the kind of systematic harassment that Connor typically employed. Their arguments for focusing attention elsewhere had been logical and well-reasoned, but Connor had dismissed them with uncharacteristic stubbornness. The turning point in Connor's campaign against Jake had come during an incident in the school parking lot that revealed capabilities Jake had been careful to conceal. A sudden thunderstorm had caught students leaving afternoon activities without adequate shelter, sending them running for cover under the limited awnings and building overhangs available. Connor had been walking to his car when he'd noticed Jake moving through the chaos with unusual efficiency, helping younger students find dry spaces and assisting teachers with equipment that was being damaged by the sudden downpour. What had caught Connor's attention wasn't Jake's willingness to help, but the way he'd moved through the confusion with obvious situational awareness and tactical thinking. Jake had automatically positioned himself where he could observe the entire area while remaining close to effective cover. His assistance to others had been provided in ways that maintained his ability to respond quickly to changing conditions. Most tellingly, Jake had demonstrated an instinctive understanding of crowd dynamics and emergency response procedures that seemed inconsistent with his apparent background as an ordinary high school student. The parking lot incident had convinced Connor that Jake was actively concealing significant capabilities and experiences that didn't match his carefully projected image of harmless mediocrity. The challenge of uncovering Jake's true nature had become personally important to Connor in ways that went beyond his usual motivations for targeting other students. Jake represented a puzzle that demanded solving, a test of Connor's ability to read people and manipulate situations to his advantage. Austin and Tyler had gradually been won over to Connor's perspective as they began to notice subtle details about Jake's behavior that suggested hidden depths. His reflexes were too quick for someone who claimed no athletic background. His knowledge of current events included details about military operations and international conflicts that seemed unusually sophisticated for a teenager. His casual comments during class discussions occasionally revealed familiarity with concepts and experiences that didn't align with his supposed civilian upbringing. The decision to escalate their campaign against Jake from passive observation to active harassment had been made during a planning session in Connor's basement rec room, where the three friends often gathered to coordinate their activities without risk of being overheard by parents or teachers. Connor had outlined his growing conviction that Jake was deliberately deceiving everyone about his background and capabilities, and he'd proposed a series of increasingly direct challenges designed to force Jake to reveal his true nature. Austin had suggested focusing on physical confrontations that would test Jake's actual fighting abilities versus his projected weakness. Tyler had recommended academic challenges that might expose inconsistencies between Jake's claimed knowledge and his demonstrated competence. Connor had approved both approaches while adding his own preference for psychological pressure that would create situations where Jake's real personality would necessarily emerge under stress. The preliminary stages of their campaign had involved subtle harassment designed to test Jake's patience and self-control without providing obvious evidence of deliberate targeting. They'd begun sitting near Jake during study halls and conducting conversations loud enough to be disruptive while technically remaining within acceptable behavioral parameters. They'd started arriving at Jake's usual library table just before he did, forcing him to find alternative seating while maintaining plausible claims about coincidental timing. These initial efforts had produced the same frustrating lack of response that had characterized Jake's reactions to Connor's earlier attempts at intimidation. Jake had adapted to each new inconvenience without complaint or visible frustration, finding alternative solutions to problems they'd created without acknowledging that the problems were deliberate. His emotional equilibrium remained unshaken, regardless of the obstacles they placed in his path. The failure of their subtle approach had convinced Connor that more dramatic action would be necessary to achieve the breakthrough he was seeking. Jake's psychological defenses were too well developed to be penetrated by standard harassment techniques, which meant that any successful strategy would need to be sufficiently shocking and humiliating to overwhelm his ability to maintain composure. The plan they'd eventually settled on would test not only Jake's self-control, but also his physical capabilities in ways that would make continued deception impossible. Connor had spent considerable time researching the most effective methods for creating maximum psychological impact while maintaining enough plausible deniability to avoid serious consequences if their plan was discovered. The solution he'd developed would require careful timing, precise execution, and coordination between all three members of his group to ensure success. Advanced physics had always been Jake's favorite class at Roosevelt High, not because the material challenged him in any meaningful way, but because Mr. Patterson encouraged the kind of logical, systematic thinking that reminded him of mission planning sessions back at Fort Bragg. The classroom itself occupied a corner of the science wing, with large windows that provided excellent natural lighting and clear sight lines to both entrances. Jake had claimed a desk in the back row during the first week of school, positioning himself where he could observe the entire room while maintaining an unobstructed path to the emergency exit that led directly to the parking lot. Thursday morning had started like any other, with Jake arriving 15 minutes early to review his notes and mentally prepare for the day's lesson on advanced projectile motion. Mr. Patterson was discussing the complex calculations required to account for air resistance, wind drift, and gravitational variations when targeting objects at extended range. The irony of learning theoretical versions of calculations he'd performed countless times in actual combat situations wasn't lost on Jake, but he'd become skilled at appearing appropriately challenged by material he could solve in his sleep. The classroom gradually filled with other students as the bell approached, and Jake noticed Connor Blake entering with his usual entourage of Austin Reed and Tyler Cross. The three football players typically arrived just before class began, claiming seats in the middle section where they could maintain their social visibility while avoiding the academic intensity that characterized the front rows. Connor had been paying unusual attention to Jake recently, asking pointed questions during group discussions and positioning himself where their paths would cross between classes. Jake had noted these behavioral changes without allowing them to alter his own routines, treating Connor's interest as a minor inconvenience rather than a genuine threat. Mr. Patterson began the day's lesson by projecting complex equations onto the whiteboard, explaining how military artillery units calculated firing solutions for targets at varying distances and elevations. Jake found himself unconsciously nodding along with the explanations, remembering similar briefings he'd received before forward observer missions, where his job had been to provide targeting data for supporting fires. The muscle memory of those experiences felt strange in the sterile environment of a suburban classroom, like trying to explain combat operations to civilians who'd never heard gunfire in anger. Midway through the class period, Mr. Patterson announced that students would be working in pairs on practice problems that required both theoretical understanding and practical application of the principles they'd been studying. Jake typically preferred individual work that allowed him to control the pace and complexity of his solutions, but partner assignments were mandatory and he'd learned to manage them without revealing the full extent of his capabilities. He was organizing his materials when Connor Blake approached his desk with what appeared to be friendly intentions. "Mind if I work with you today, Jake?" Connor asked, pulling up a chair before waiting for a response. "I've been struggling with some of these concepts, and I noticed you seem to have a pretty good handle on the mathematics involved." The request seemed reasonable on the surface, but Jake had observed enough of Connor's behavior to recognize that nothing the quarterback did was without calculated purpose. Austin and Tyler had positioned themselves at nearby desks, creating a loose circle around Jake's position that could appear casual to observers, while actually serving to isolate him from potential assistance. Jake nodded his agreement, knowing that refusing Connor's request would draw more attention than accepting it. He'd dealt with similar situations during his military service, where potentially hostile individuals had approached under the guise of friendly cooperation while actually conducting reconnaissance or probing for weaknesses. The key was to remain polite and helpful while revealing nothing that could be used against him later. Mr. Patterson assigned each pair a complex problem, involving calculating the optimal trajectory for a projectile launched from an elevated position toward a target at a lower elevation, accounting for various environmental factors that would affect the flight path. Connor made a show of struggling with the initial calculations, asking Jake to explain concepts that any student in advanced physics should have mastered weeks earlier. Jake recognized the performance for what it was, a deliberate attempt to position himself as the more knowledgeable partner while simultaneously probing for information about Jake's background and training. The questions Connor asked were designed to seem innocent while actually testing whether Jake's understanding came from textbook study or practical experience. Jake answered carefully, providing helpful explanations while avoiding any references to real-world applications that might reveal his military background. As they worked through the problem, Jake became aware that Connor was paying more attention to his methodology than to the actual solutions they were developing. Connor seemed particularly interested in the shortcuts Jake used to simplify complex calculations, the way he instinctively accounted for variables that weren't explicitly mentioned in the problem statement, and his casual familiarity with military terminology that occasionally slipped into his explanations. Jake realized he was being studied like a specimen under a microscope, with Connor cataloging every response for later analysis. The tension in their interaction became more apparent as the class period progressed. Connor's questions became increasingly specific and personal, moving beyond academic curiosity into areas that felt like interrogation. He asked about Jake's previous schools, his family's background, his hobbies and interests outside class. Each question was framed as friendly conversation, but Jake recognized the pattern of systematic information gathering that intelligence operatives used when developing profiles of potential targets. He answered with carefully prepared responses that revealed nothing significant while maintaining the appearance of cooperation. When the bell rang signaling the end of class, Jake had expected Connor to simply move on to his next obligation. Instead, Connor lingered as other students filed out of the classroom, making casual conversation about their shared next period, and suggesting they walk together to their respective destinations. Jake found himself surrounded by Connor, Austin, and Tyler as they left Mr. Patterson's classroom, ostensibly engaged in friendly discussion, but actually being herded toward a destination he hadn't chosen. The hallway outside the science wing was typically crowded during the transition between third and fourth periods, with students hurrying to reach their next classes before the tardy bell rang. Jake noticed that Connor was guiding their group toward a less traveled corridor that led to the technical education building, where shop classes and computer labs were housed in a section of the school that saw minimal foot traffic during academic periods. The change in direction was subtle enough to seem natural, but Jake's situational awareness training had taught him to recognize when he was being maneuvered into an isolated location. As they walked, Connor maintained a steady stream of conversation that seemed designed to keep Jake distracted from their changing environment. He asked follow-up questions about their physics assignment, complimented Jake on his problem-solving abilities, and made jokes about Mr. Patterson's teaching style. That required responses to maintain social politeness. Austin and Tyler contributed occasional comments that kept Jake engaged while positioning themselves to control his movement options. The entire interaction felt choreographed, like a military operation disguised as casual socialization. The technical education building occupied the oldest section of Roosevelt High's campus, constructed in the 1960s, when vocational training was considered an essential component of public education. The hallways were narrower than those in the main academic building, with lower ceilings and fluorescent lighting that created harsh shadows in corners and alcoves. Classroom doors were spaced further apart to accommodate the larger workshops and laboratories that housed industrial equipment and computer terminals. Most importantly, the building was far enough from administrative offices that conversations conducted at normal volume were unlikely to be overheard by teachers or staff members. Connor led their group into a specific classroom that Jake recognized as the Advanced Electronics Lab, a space equipped with workbenches, testing equipment, and storage cabinets that contained various tools and components used for engineering projects. The room was empty during fourth period, when most technical education classes were held in the main workshop areas. Connor closed the door behind them and positioned himself between Jake and the exit, while Austin and Tyler spread out to occupy strategic positions that would prevent any attempt to leave without confrontation. "So Jake," Connor said, his tone becoming noticeably less friendly now that they were alone, "I've been thinking about our conversation in physics class, and I have to say, you seem to know an awful lot about ballistics for someone who claims to have learned everything from textbooks." The comment was delivered with a smile that didn't reach Connor's eyes, and Jake realized that whatever test he'd been undergoing was now entering a more direct phase. The pretense of friendly cooperation was being abandoned in favor of open interrogation. Jake maintained his composure while rapidly assessing his tactical situation. 3 opponents, all larger than himself, positioned to control his movement and prevent escape. The room contained various tools and equipment that could potentially be used as weapons, but resorting to violence would expose capabilities he'd promised his mother to keep hidden. His best option was to continue playing the role of harmless civilian while looking for opportunities to de-escalate the confrontation and extract himself safely. "I just enjoy studying the subject," Jake replied, keeping his voice level and non-threatening. "Physics has always been interesting to me, especially the practical applications of theoretical concepts." He deliberately avoided mentioning anything that might confirm Connor's suspicions about his background, instead presenting himself as an academically motivated student with intellectual curiosity rather than practical experience. The explanation was technically truthful while being carefully incomplete. Connor exchanged glances with Austin and Tyler, some form of silent communication passing between them that Jake couldn't interpret but recognized as coordination for their next move. Austin moved closer to the door while Tyler positioned himself near the storage cabinets, effectively boxing Jake into the center of the room with limited options for movement. The shift in their positioning was subtle but unmistakable to someone trained to recognize tactical deployments. "Here's the thing, Jake," Connor continued, beginning to pace in a pattern that brought him alternately closer to and further from Jake's position. "I've been watching you for weeks now, and you don't act like other kids your age. You move differently, you think differently, you handle stress differently. So I'm wondering what you're hiding, and more importantly, why you think you can come into my school and pretend to be something you're not." The accusation was delivered with increasing intensity, and Jake realized that Connor had invested significant time and effort in observing his behavior. The quarterback's analysis was uncomfortably accurate, even if his conclusions about Jake's motivations were incorrect. Jake had indeed been pretending to be something he wasn't, but not for the reasons Connor suspected. His deception was motivated by a desire for normalcy rather than any attempt to gain advantage or deceive others for malicious purposes. "I'm not pretending to be anything," Jake said, maintaining eye contact while internally calculating distances and reaction times for everyone in the room. "I'm just trying to get through high school like everyone else. I don't want any trouble with you or anyone else." The statement was completely honest, representing Jake's genuine desire to complete his education, without complications that might expose his background or require him to use capabilities that belong to his military past rather than his civilian present. Connor's laugh was harsh and humorless, suggesting that Jake's attempt at placation had failed to achieve its intended effect. "See, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Most kids in your situation would be scared right now, maybe trying to negotiate or make excuses. But you're just standing there like you're evaluating the situation, like you're planning your next move. That's not normal teenage behavior, Jake. That's something else entirely." The observation was disturbingly perceptive, and Jake realized that his military training was creating behavioral patterns that were more obvious to observers than he'd realized. Months of trying to suppress his situational awareness and tactical thinking had been less successful than he'd hoped. Connor had identified enough inconsistencies to develop suspicions that were dangerously close to the truth, even if he lacked specific details about Jake's actual background. Austin stepped forward from his position near the door, cracking his knuckles in a gesture that was clearly intended to be intimidating. Maybe we need to help Jake remember how normal teenagers act when they're in over their heads, he suggested, his voice carrying the kind of casual menace that bullies use to frighten their targets into submission. Tyler nodded his agreement while moving to flank Jake from the opposite side, completing their encirclement and eliminating any remaining options for peaceful departure. Jake felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied potential combat situations, his body automatically preparing for violence while his mind worked to find alternatives that wouldn't require revealing his training. He'd faced similar scenarios countless times during his military service, but those confrontations had been with enemy combatants who represented legitimate threats to mission success or personal survival. Connor and his friends were simply misguided. Teenagers whose worst intentions probably involved humiliation rather than serious physical harm. "Look," Jake said, raising his hands in a gesture that appeared defensive, but actually positioned them for rapid response if violence became unavoidable. "I don't know what you think I'm hiding, but I can promise you it's not what you imagine. I really am just trying to fit in and get through school without any drama. Whatever you want from me, maybe we can work something out without anyone getting hurt." Connor's expression shifted to something that might have been disappointment, as if Jake's attempt at negotiation had confirmed some negative expectation about his character. "You know what your problem is, Jake. You still think you can control this situation. You still think you're dealing with people who are going to listen to reason and back down when you ask nicely. But that's not how the world works, and it's definitely not how my world works." The three football players moved simultaneously, Austin and Tyler grabbing Jake's arms, while Connor stepped back to observe their handiwork. Jake allowed himself to be restrained rather than resisting immediately, still hoping to resolve the confrontation without resorting to violence that would expose capabilities he'd worked so hard to conceal. The grip on his arms was firm, but not painful, suggesting that Connor's group was more interested in control than immediate harm. "Now we're going to have a little demonstration," Connor announced, pulling out his cell phone and beginning to record video. "I want to see how the mysterious Jake Thompson handles real pressure, the kind that can't be solved with careful planning and tactical thinking. Maybe after today, you'll understand that some problems require different solutions than the ones you learned wherever you learned them." Jake realized that Connor intended to create a public record of whatever humiliation he had planned, probably for distribution among the student body as both entertainment and warning to others who might consider challenging his authority. The knowledge that his response would be documented and potentially viewed by hundreds of his classmates added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. Any reaction he chose would become permanent evidence that could be analyzed and scrutinized long after the immediate confrontation ended. Austin and Tyler began moving Jake toward a specific location in the classroom, their destination apparently predetermined as part of whatever plan Connor had developed. Jake noticed a metal chair that had been positioned directly beneath a ceiling-mounted projection system, the furniture positioned in a way that seemed deliberate rather than coincidental. His tactical assessment capabilities automatically began calculating potential threats and escape routes, even as he continued hoping that the situation could be resolved without violence. As they approached the center of the room, Jake's attention was drawn to several unusual details that suggested extensive preparation for this confrontation. The chair beneath the projection mount wasn't the standard classroom furniture he'd seen throughout Roosevelt High, but rather a heavier metal frame, construction that looked like it had been borrowed from the industrial arts workshop. More concerning, Jake could see evidence of recent drilling activity in the ceiling tiles directly above the chair, with small metal fragments scattered on the floor that hadn't been cleaned up completely. Tyler released Jake's arm momentarily to retrieve something from one of the storage cabinets, returning with a coil of heavy-duty rope and what appeared to be climbing hardware typically used for securing loads at height. The equipment was professional grade, far beyond what would normally be available in a high school electronics lab, suggesting that Connor's group had invested considerable resources in planning whatever demonstration they intended to conduct. Jake's military experience with logistics and mission planning allowed him to recognize the level of preparation that had gone into this operation. "Here's how this is going to work," Connor explained, continuing to record while Austin and Tyler positioned Jake directly beneath the ceiling mount. "We've made some modifications to this classroom that I think you're going to find interesting. See, yesterday during lunch, we came in here with some tools and did a little engineering project. That chair you're looking at is now permanently attached to the ceiling structure above you, held in place by some very serious hardware." Jake looked up and realized that Connor's group had indeed managed to bolt the metal chair to the ceiling mounting system, creating what amounted to a suspended seat that dangled approximately 8 feet above the floor. The engineering involved was more sophisticated than he'd expected from high school students, with multiple attachment points and safety cables that suggested someone with genuine technical knowledge had supervised the installation. The chair hung at a slight angle, rotating slowly as air currents moved through the room. "The beautiful thing about our little project," Connor continued, "is that we use the same mounting points that hold up the projection equipment, so it's anchored to the structural beams rather than just the ceiling tiles. That chair could probably support several hundred pounds without any problem. Of course, we're not planning to test it with that much weight. Just one scared little transfer student who's about to learn what happens when you mess with the wrong people." Austin and Tyler tightened their grip on Jake's arms, preventing him from moving away from the position directly beneath the suspended chair. Jake could see that they intended to somehow secure him to the chair while it remained suspended, creating a situation where he would be helplessly dangling from the ceiling for whatever duration they chose. The psychological impact of such an experience would be enormous, particularly if other students were brought in to witness his predicament, or if video of the incident was distributed throughout the school. "You see, Jake," Connor said, moving closer while maintaining his recording angle, "I've spent a lot of time thinking about what makes you tick, and I've come to the conclusion that you've been hiding something significant from everyone at this school. Maybe you're not as harmless as you pretend to be. Maybe you've got some kind of background that you don't want people to know about. Well, today we're going to find out exactly what you're made of when you can't rely on whatever tricks you've been using to stay invisible." Tyler had begun arranging the rope and hardware in preparation for securing Jake to the suspended chair, while Austin maintained his grip to prevent any attempt at escape. Jake realized that his options for avoiding this confrontation were rapidly diminishing, and that continuing to play the role of helpless victim might result in a situation that would be genuinely dangerous rather than merely humiliating. The improvised suspension system looked reasonably secure, but Jake's knowledge of rigging and load calculations suggested that it hadn't been professionally installed or properly tested for safety. "The way I figure it," Connor continued, "once you're hanging up there with nowhere to go and no way to get down without help, you'll be a lot more willing to have an honest conversation about who you really are and what you're really doing at Roosevelt High. Maybe you'll even be grateful enough for our eventual assistance that you'll remember to show proper respect to the people who run this school." Jake's assessment of the situation had reached a critical decision point. He could continue attempting to de-escalate through passive compliance, hoping that Connor's group would be satisfied with a relatively minor humiliation and release him without serious harm. Alternatively, he could abandon his carefully maintained civilian persona and use his military training to extract himself from the situation by force, knowing that such action would expose capabilities he'd worked months to conceal and potentially create consequences that extended far beyond this immediate confrontation. The decision was made for him when Tyler attempted to loop the rope around Jake's torso, while Austin adjusted his grip to allow access to Jake's midsection. The movement brought Tyler within range of Jake's legs, and Austin's repositioning created a momentary weakness in the restraint that held Jake's arms. Jake's combat training identified the tactical opportunity instantly, and muscle memory that had been suppressed for months suddenly reasserted itself with overwhelming intensity. Jake's response was swift and decisive, demonstrating the kind of controlled violence that had made him an effective paratrooper, despite his youth and small stature. His right leg swept Tyler's feet out from under him with enough force to send the larger student crashing into a nearby workbench, scattering electronic components across the floor. Simultaneously, Jake twisted his shoulders to break Austin's grip while driving his elbow backward into the football player's solar plexus, causing Austin to double over as the air was driven from his lungs. The entire sequence lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but its effects were immediately apparent to everyone in the room. Tyler was groaning on the floor among scattered circuit boards and testing equipment, holding his lower back where he'd impacted the workbench edge. Austin was struggling to breathe while trying to maintain his footing. His face flushed red as he fought to recover from the precisely delivered elbow strike. Most importantly, Jake was no longer restrained and had positioned himself with clear access to the door and freedom. Connor's reaction was a mixture of shock and excitement, as if Jake's demonstration of fighting capability had confirmed suspicions he'd harbored for weeks. "I knew it," he shouted, still recording with his cell phone despite the rapid change. "In circumstances, I knew you were hiding something. Nobody moves like that unless they've had serious training, military training." "Where did you serve, Jake? What kind of unit were you with? How did you end up in high school when you should probably be carrying a rifle somewhere overseas?" Jake realized that his momentary loss of control had accomplished exactly what months of careful deception had been designed to prevent. His true capabilities were now exposed, recorded on video, and in the hands of someone who would undoubtedly use that information to maximum advantage. The careful balance he'd maintained between his military past and civilian present had been shattered in a few seconds of instinctive response to physical threat. "You want to know the truth?" Jake said, his voice carrying a new tone of authority that hadn't been present during his weeks of playing the harmless transfer student. "Fine, my name is Jake Thompson, and I'm a former United States Army paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne Division. I completed 2 combat tours in Afghanistan before my discharge earlier this year. I've jumped out of aircraft over 40 times, including 12 combat jumps into hostile territory. I'm trained in advanced combat, tactics, weapons systems, explosive ordnance disposal, and field medicine." The silence that followed Jake's declaration was profound, broken only by Tyler's continued groaning and Austin's labored breathing as he slowly recovered from the elbow strike. Connor's expression had shifted from triumphant excitement to something approaching genuine fear, as if he was beginning to understand that his carefully planned intimidation had targeted someone far more dangerous than he'd imagined. "I came to Roosevelt High because I wanted to finish my education and try to have a normal teenage experience," Jake continued, his posture now reflecting the military bearing he'd worked so hard to suppress. "I've been trying to fit in and avoid exactly this kind of situation, because I know what I'm capable of when pushed too far. I've seen real violence, Connor. I've been in firefights where people died. I've called in artillery strikes and medical evacuations and done things that most people never want to think about, let alone experience." Tyler had managed to sit up against the workbench, his face pale and his breathing shallow as he processed what he'd just heard. Austin was standing upright again, but maintaining careful distance from Jake, clearly recognizing that the balance of power in the room had shifted dramatically. Connor continued recording, but his earlier confidence had been replaced by uncertainty about how to proceed with this new information. "The reason I haven't told anyone about my background," Jake explained, "is because I wanted to leave that part of my life behind and focus on being a normal high school student. My mother was worried that people would treat me differently if they knew about my military service, and she was right. You've been treating me like a target because you thought I was weak and couldn't defend myself. Now you know better, and everything changes from here." Connor lowered his phone slightly, apparently realizing that he was now recording evidence of his own poor judgment rather than documentation of a successful intimidation campaign. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "There's no way you're old enough to have served in the military, let alone completed combat deployments. You're 17 years old, Jake. The Army doesn't take soldiers that young." "You're right," Jake replied. "They don't. I enlisted using false documentation when I was 15, after my father was killed in Iraq. I wanted to follow in his footsteps and serve my country, and I was willing to lie about my age to make that happen. The Army discovered the truth during a routine records check last year and discharged me with full honors and educational benefits. My service was real, Connor. My training was real, and what just happened to your friends was real." The implications of Jake's revelation were beginning to sink in for all three of his would-be tormentors. They'd spent weeks planning an elaborate humiliation for someone they'd assumed was a helpless target, only to discover that they'd been targeting a combat veteran with advanced training in exactly the kind of violence they'd been threatening to employ. The suspended chair hanging from the ceiling suddenly seemed like a monument to their miscalculation rather than evidence of their cleverness. Austin spoke for the first time since recovering from Jake's elbow strike, his voice hoarse and uncertain. "If you're really a soldier, then why didn't you just tell us? Why let us think you were just some scared transfer student? We never would have messed with you if we'd known you could fight back like that." Jake's laugh was bitter and entirely without humor. "Because that's exactly the point, Austin. I didn't want to be the guy people were afraid of or the guy other students tried to challenge to prove themselves. I wanted to be normal. I wanted to worry about homework and college applications and whether someone would ask me to the spring dance. I wanted to experience the teenage years I missed while I was learning how to kill people and break things for my country." Tyler had finally managed to stand up, though he was clearly still in pain from his impact with the workbench. "So what happens now?" he asked, looking nervously between Jake and Connor. "Are you going to report us to the principal? Are you going to tell everyone about this? Because if you do, we're all going to be in serious trouble for what we did with that chair." Jake considered the question carefully, weighing his options while trying to determine the best path forward. Reporting the incident would expose his own background to school administrators and potentially to the broader community, defeating the purpose of months spent maintaining his civilian identity. On the other hand, allowing Connor's group to escape consequences for their actions might encourage them to target other students with similar harassment campaigns. "Here's what's going to happen," Jake said finally, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from making life and death decisions under pressure. "You're going to remove that chair from the ceiling and restore this classroom to its original condition. You're going to delete the video you just recorded and never mention this conversation to anyone. And you're going to stop targeting other students with your intimidation campaigns, because now you know that you never really know who you might be messing with." Connor's response was immediate and defensive. "You can't just order us around like we're your soldiers, Jake. This is still my school, and you're still just another student here. What makes you think you can tell us what to do?" Jake's smile was cold and entirely without warmth, reflecting experiences that had aged him far beyond his 17 years. "What makes me think I can tell you what to do is the fact that I just disabled 2 of your friends in about 3 seconds, and we all know I could do the same to you if I chose to. But more importantly, Connor, you're missing the bigger picture here. You wanted to know what I was hiding, and now you do. The question is whether you're smart enough to understand what that information means for your future behavior." The silence that followed was heavy with implications that all 4 students understood perfectly. Jake had revealed capabilities that went far beyond normal teenage confrontations, and Connor's group had documented evidence of their own premeditated harassment that could result in serious consequences if brought to administrative attention. The balance of power that had seemed so clear when they'd entered the electronics lab had been completely reversed through Jake's demonstration of his true nature. Tyler was the first to break the uncomfortable silence. "We'll take down the chair," he said quietly, avoiding eye contact with Jake while addressing Connor. "This whole thing was a mistake from the beginning. We never should have tried to mess with someone we didn't really understand. I don't want any part of whatever comes next if we keep pushing this." Austin nodded his agreement, still rubbing his chest where Jake's elbow had made contact. "Tyler's right. This got way out of hand, and we're lucky nobody got seriously hurt. If Jake wanted to file assault charges against us for what we were planning to do, he probably could. We should just call it even and move on." Connor looked around the room, taking in the evidence of his failed intimidation campaign and the completely altered dynamic between himself and his intended target. The suspended chair hanging from the ceiling seemed to mock his attempt to establish dominance, while his two friends were clearly ready to abandon the confrontation entirely. Most significantly, Jake was no longer the mysterious puzzle he'd been determined to solve, but rather a confirmed threat who possessed capabilities Connor couldn't match. "Fine," Connor said finally, his voice lacking the confidence that had characterized his earlier statements. "We'll take down the chair and clean up this mess. But this doesn't change anything between us. Jake, you might have some fancy military training, but you're still in my school and my town. There are other ways to deal with people who don't fit in, ways that don't require getting physical." Jake's response was measured, but carried an undertone of warning that was unmistakable to everyone present. "You're absolutely right, Connor. There are other ways to handle conflicts, and I hope you choose to explore those options rather than continuing down the path that brought us here today. Because while I've been trying very hard to be a normal high school student, I haven't forgotten how to be a soldier when the situation requires it. And trust me, you really don't want to find out what that looks like." The threat was delivered with the kind of quiet intensity that made it clear Jake wasn't bluffing or posturing. His military training had included psychological warfare techniques designed to achieve objectives without resorting to violence, and Connor's group was now experiencing the effectiveness of those methods firsthand. The knowledge that Jake possessed, capabilities they couldn't match or predict, had fundamentally altered the power dynamic between them. Over the next 20 minutes, Connor, Austin, and Tyler worked together to dismantle their improvised suspension system and restore the electronics lab to its original configuration. The process required significant effort and coordination, particularly removing the bolts they'd installed in the ceiling mounting system without causing permanent damage to the classroom infrastructure. Jake supervised their work while maintaining the kind of alert posture that suggested he was prepared for any attempt at renewed hostilities. As they worked, the three football players engaged in whispered conversations that Jake could partially overhear, discussing the implications of what they'd learned and debating how to handle the situation moving forward. Tyler and Austin appeared genuinely chastened by their experience, expressing regret about their role in planning the harassment campaign and concern about potential consequences if word of the incident spread beyond the 4 students involved. Connor remained defiant, but seemed to understand that his options for continued aggression had been severely limited by Jake's demonstration of superior capabilities. When the classroom had been returned to its normal state, Connor approached Jake one final time before they prepared to leave. "You realize this isn't over, right?" he said, his voice low enough that Austin and Tyler couldn't hear the exchange. "Maybe I can't intimidate you physically, but there are other pressures I can bring to bear. My family has influence in this town, Jake. We can make your life difficult in ways you haven't considered." Jake's response was immediate and decisive. "Connor, let me explain something about pressure and influence that you might not understand. I've been shot at by people who wanted to kill me, not just make my life difficult. I've operated in environments where a single mistake could result in death for myself and my teammates. Your family's local influence and your high school social politics don't constitute the kind of pressure that's going to change my behavior or make me back down from doing what I think is right. The quarterback's attempt at intimidation had clearly failed to achieve its intended effect, and Jake's matter-of-fact delivery made it clear that he wasn't impressed by threats of social or economic consequences. Connor's world of privilege and inherited authority had no equivalent to the life and death responsibilities Jake had carried during his military service, and the comparison highlighted the fundamental differences in their experiences and capabilities. Besides, Jake continued, you seem to be forgetting that I now have video evidence of your group planning to suspend me from the ceiling against my will, which probably constitutes kidnapping, assault, and several other criminal charges that would be much more serious than anything your family's influence could protect you from. So maybe we should focus on making sure this incident stays between the four of us, rather than discussing future conflicts that might not work out the way you expect. Connor's expression showed that he hadn't considered the legal implications of their failed harassment campaign, or the fact that Jake could potentially use their own documentation against them if the situation escalated further. The recording he'd made to document Jake's humiliation had instead captured evidence of premeditated criminal activity that could result in serious consequences for everyone involved in planning the operation. The four students left the electronics lab separately, with Jake departing first to avoid any appearance of coordination or conspiracy. As he walked through the empty hallways toward his next class, Jake reflected on the events that had just transpired and their likely consequences for his remaining time at Roosevelt High. His carefully maintained anonymity had been shattered. His military background was now known to at least 3 other students, and his violent response to physical threat had demonstrated capabilities that would be impossible to conceal if word of the incident spread. The promise he'd made to his mother about avoiding situations that might expose his training had been broken, though arguably through no fault of his own. Connor's group had created circumstances that made violent response unavoidable, and Jake's actions had been measured and appropriate given the threat level they'd represented. Still, the incident marked a fundamental change in his status at Roosevelt High and his ability to maintain the normal teenage experience he'd been seeking. As Jake entered his next classroom and took his usual seat in the back row, he noticed that several students were looking at him with expressions that seemed different from their usual casual indifference. Word traveled quickly in high school environments, and he suspected that rumors about some kind of confrontation involving Connor Blake's group were already beginning to circulate. The challenge would be managing those rumors and preventing them from growing into investigations that might expose more details about his background than he was prepared to reveal. The remainder of the school day passed without additional incident, but Jake remained alert for signs that Connor's group might attempt some form of retaliation or that word of their confrontation had reached teachers or administrators. His heightened awareness was a return to the operational mindset he'd maintained during his military service, and he realized that suppressing those instincts again would require conscious effort and time. As students began leaving for the day, Jake noticed Marcus Rivera approaching his locker with an expression of concern that suggested he'd heard something about the earlier events. Marcus had been Jake's closest friend at Roosevelt High, and his reaction to whatever rumors were circulating would provide important information about how to manage the situation moving forward. "Hey Jake," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that hadn't been present in their previous conversations. "I heard there was some kind of incident today involving you and Connor Blake's crew. People are saying some pretty wild things about what happened, and I wanted to check if you were okay and see if there was anything I could do to help." Jake realized that the rumors had indeed begun spreading, and that Marcus was offering support without yet understanding the full implications of what had transpired. The friendship they'd developed had been based on mutual respect for privacy and shared interests that didn't require extensive personal disclosure. Now Jake faced the challenge of maintaining that relationship while managing the aftermath of his exposed capabilities. "Thanks for asking, Marcus," Jake replied carefully, "but I think the rumors are probably a lot more dramatic than the actual events. Connor and his friends were being jerks, things got a little heated, and now hopefully they'll leave me alone." Sometimes bullies need to be reminded that not everyone is going to put up with their behavior indefinitely. Marcus nodded apparently, accepting Jake's simplified version of events, while recognizing that there were probably additional details he wasn't being told. "Well, if you need someone to back you up or verify your side of things, just let me know. Connor's group has been causing problems for people for years, and it's about time someone stood up to them. I'm just glad you didn't get hurt in whatever happened." The conversation confirmed Jake's assessment that rumors were circulating but hadn't yet reached levels that would require immediate damage control. Marcus's offer of support was genuine and appreciated, even though Jake knew that involving his friend in any potential conflict with Connor's group would only create additional complications for everyone involved. As Jake walked home from school that afternoon, he contemplated the events of the day and their likely consequences for his future at Roosevelt High. His cover as a harmless transfer student had been blown. His military background was no longer secret, and his violent capabilities had been demonstrated in ways that would be impossible to deny or explain away. The careful balance he'd maintained between his past and present had been destroyed in a few seconds of instinctive response to physical threat. The challenge now would be managing the aftermath of his exposure, while completing his education and maintaining his relationship with his mother, who would undoubtedly be concerned about the implications of any incident that revealed his military training. Jake understood that his options for avoiding future conflicts had been significantly reduced, and that his remaining time at Roosevelt High would require different strategies for managing social dynamics and potential threats. Most importantly, Jake realized that his attempt to leave his military identity behind and embrace civilian life had been fundamentally naive. The skills and instincts he'd developed during his service were too deeply ingrained to be suppressed indefinitely, and situations requiring their application would continue to arise regardless of his preferences or intentions. The question was whether he could find ways to integrate his military experience with his civilian goals, rather than treating them as mutually exclusive aspects of his identity. As he approached his apartment complex, Jake noticed his mother's car in the parking lot and realized that she was home earlier than usual from her shift at the hospital. He hoped that word of the day's events hadn't reached her yet, but he understood that in a community the size of Pine Ridge, news of any significant incident at the high school would travel quickly through the network of parents and community members who worked at various local institutions. The conversation he would need to have with his mother about the events at school would be difficult and potentially emotional, particularly since it would require acknowledging that his promise to avoid situations requiring his military training had been broken. Jake steeled himself for that discussion while climbing the stairs to their apartment, knowing that honesty about what had transpired would be essential for maintaining their relationship and determining how to proceed with his education. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.